Are you or anyone else you know interested in buying or selling a home? How about saving the planet? Climate Change Realty is the only company operating in all 50 states that allows you to create thousands of dollars in donations absolutely for free. Yes, that's right. Our service and your donations are free. Climate Change Realty can connect you with one of the best real estate agents in your city. And because of that connection, a full 25% of your real estate agent's commissions will be donated to a 501c3 nonprofit organization of your choice. Real estate agents earn between 2 to 3% of the final sales price when they help you buy or sell a home. That's at least $500 donated for every $100,000 worth of real estate sold when you find your real estate agent with Climate Change Realty. Visit www.ccrboulder.com today and click Find an Agent to help us transform the real estate market into a battery for the regenerative economy. Welcome to the podcast. Steven, great to meet you, man. Thanks so much for taking some time to come on the show. Looking forward to the conversation.
Likewise. Thanks for having me on.
You got it, man. You're very welcome. And we always like to get this podcast started with a bit of background on who you are and how you got to be doing the work you're doing at the current moment.
Yeah, my career trajectory has been weird. So my name is Steven Perkins. I'm currently the Vice President of Grassroots Strategy for the American Conservation Coalition, which I'm sure we'll talk about here in a little bit. But my path to getting to a climate environmental nonprofit was very untraditional. But I think, growing up in Texas here, I always say that we have just about every climate packed into one state. You go out west and you get the desert. Down south, you get, in my opinion, a very humid, climate. And then I'm up here in North Texas and we have hill country, all this stuff. And so growing up, my dad and I would go camping and just a lot of outdoor stuff, which, kind of built up this, without me even maybe knowing it, this inherent love for the environment. But that is not the direction that I was necessarily going to go. I went to college for political science. I thought maybe I would do radio, TV, journalism, media, political journalism. Very happy that didn't happen. It's gotten a lot stressful in the past couple of years.
It's a mess.
Yeah. But I always enjoyed politics and I always enjoyed business and sort of this idea of how do you communicate, market, sell ideas, services, products that are sort of emerging, right? So I spent my first couple of years working for a leadership development event management company where I worked with a lot of education-based nonprofits across the country, everything from putting on their national conferences to coaching their leadership teams and helping solve some of the leadership team challenges they're facing. I went from there to a digital marketing firm that focused primarily on political campaigns. And so that was a stressful couple of midterms and elections, working with political campaigns and advocacy organizations and communicating in a time that was not the best for Republicans, communicating why they should be elected. Had some good success there. In the course of all of that, Benji Backer, who's the president and founder of ACC, we had been friends through some ventures that I had done in college. And he had started this organization about engaging conservatives on the environment. And a spot opened up where they needed more leadership on our grassroots side as we build out our field program. And I was, I had known him, some other leadership team members in the organization. And so kind of made the pivot from leadership development to political marketing to now managing a team of 8 field staffers who are building communities around the country of people who care about the environment. And so it's been an interesting story, an interesting trajectory of all of that. But I think at the core of it, it still goes back to we are communicating this idea that climate change is an important issue and that there are things that need to be done on it to an audience that in recent decades have not been as open to that. And so that's the fun challenge that I like as part of my role is how do we do that effectively and how do we build a movement in a space that from the outside looking in is not primed for this kind of movement.
Yeah, aren't challenges fun? Don't worry, man. The pivots will continue. Believe me, as you continue going. Where did you go to school?
My first year I did at Stephen F. Austin State University in East Texas, which I learned I'm not good out in the country. And then I transferred to the University of Texas at Arlington. So not the big UT campus in Austin, but the one up here at DFW.
And is that where Benji was going to school as well?
Benji's up in Seattle, and so it's kind
Hmm.
of interesting how nowadays you can meet some of your best friends just through Twitter, right? And I in college I was starting a publication, a conservative publication. The idea was conservatism at that time was going through some weird changes, and I was very concerned about some of the more negative messaging that was coming out. And so I got a group of people together, a group of young conservatives who are kind of phrase for it was we're conservative in our ideology, but we're moderate in our approach and our temperament, which is
Mm.
to say we're not crazy, or at least that was the goal. And Benji was someone who I had followed for a little bit, saw some of his CPAC speeches, reached out to him sort of cold, and he became one of our biggest helpers and supporters in helping getting that off the ground. And then conversely, whenever ACC was getting started, I was able to help him get some of that off the ground. So that's how him and I met. It's a story of kind of going way back in terms of us helping each other out for each of our ventures.
That's fantastic. Now, I'll tell you this, I seldom meet people who would call themselves a Democrat or a Republican or a liberal or a conservative. Before we kind of dive into talking about ACC, I'm wondering what it means to you to be a conservative and why you kind of adhere to that ideology, if you might call it
Yeah,
that.
it's a tough phrase nowadays. I found that whether you're a conservative or a liberal, those are terms that are it means something different to everybody who you talk to nowadays because of all the different influences there. For me, the initial draw to conservatism was this idea of personal responsibility and really people at the forefront of a country's leadership. In other words, in my mind, I think there are plenty of areas where the government needs to be active and they need to mobilize certain things. But in my mind, our country wasn't started by people waiting around for a government to be reformed, and it's not going to continue to thrive by people waiting around for the government. And so I think that really the best way for our country to operate is for a strong central government that does the essential functions that a government should do, but ultimately one that gets out of the way and lets people experiment and do things on their own and lets the states kind of be at the forefront of most of the policy. And so for me, being a conservative is truly about individual liberties, putting the individual at the forefront and making sure that people have the ability to live the life that they want to live.
How does that differ from like a libertarian point of view?
They go together. I think on my end, again, libertarianism. There's this kind of spectrum that you can go up and down of how extreme that is. I mean, I consider myself sort of a fusionist between a conservative and a libertarian. I don't go as far as to say, you could say limited government, and sometimes that's a very small idea of government. I think with where things are today and just the fact that we're maturing as a country and as a world and as a society, we can't have the same size government that we had in the late 1700s, right? But I do think there are plenty of places to cut fat, and I certainly agree with libertarians on individual liberties and a lot of those themes revolving around the government getting out of the way, letting people live their lives.
As do I. What's interesting is when you talk about states' rights, it's interesting because when you look at Europe, you would think that they are people will compare like France to the US, but really it doesn't make sense to do that. It would make more sense to compare a state. And by the way, everyone outside the US calls nation states states. So it would make more sense to compare France to Texas than France to the United States. And yeah, the federal government in the U.S. is like the big behemoth that is a big bully around the world. But we're not going to go deep into that. Let's talk about the American Conservation Coalition. What exactly is it? Why does it exist?
Sure. So the American Conservation Coalition, or ACC as we refer to it, is an environmental education and advocacy nonprofit. And our goal, our mission is to build the conservative environmental movement. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. But ultimately, what it looks like is we're an organization of young, center to right of center young Americans who are tired of waiting around for solutions, for government solutions, climate change, and we're just much more interested in being the action and being, to steal a quote, being the change we wish to see in the world. And so we have, thousands of members across the country. We're active in over 100 different communities across the country. And in each of those communities, we have a branch, or another way to think of it is a chapter. And in each of those branches, we have couple dozen, typically is the average size, couple dozen folks there who certainly do advocacy, and they're involved in contacting their members of Congress, other elected officials, being good advocates for our right of center market-based approach to the environment. But also they're getting out and they're cleaning up parks, they're planting trees, they're going on hikes, they're putting on educational events about what does leave no trace mean, and how can we do that as outdoorsmen? What are natural climate solutions, and how can that help us fight climate change? And so, really, the reason why we approach it from a semi-political lens, like I said, building the conservative environmental movement, is because on the local level, climate action is not political. We can all agree that planting a tree is a good thing. We can all come together, whether you are the most far left person or the most far right person. We can come together and clean up a park and feel good about ourselves and form community around that. But at the end of the day, there are policy questions that are happening on the federal and even the state and local levels. And we have to admit, there are competing ideas, competing approaches about how to solve that. And from our point of view, we want an approach that is less government heavy and more individual, private industry, allowing capitalism to do the thing that capitalism does well, which is solve problems and make things better. And so that is our market-based solution, or our market-based approach that we bring to solving climate change. And so, we try to get people educated about just what that approach means. And there's a lot to it. I mean, as I'm sure climate policy can range in all different directions. And the idea is not that our members will know everything about that, but typically our members come to a branch with passions of their own. Some people are really, they come from an agriculture background. That's sort of what they're interested in. Some of them are more of like living in an urban area, and they want to talk about how urban areas can mitigate climate change. Or some people, really enjoy the wildlife or the natural area preservation. And so there's a place for everybody, no matter their interests in our organization. We do a lot of different campaigns focusing on different topics, but we're really all about bringing people together and just getting something done.
Yeah, as am I. And I'll say that I came to the work that I'm doing from a very, very similar angle. I think in the past, I've spoken a lot on the show about having a tendency to think that the market will do a better job at fixing the problem. But at the end of the day, I don't think that's really fair to say, because I don't really know what is going to be the most effective way to fix the problem. That's why I've kind of decided to allow my clients to make the end decision of where they want their impact to be created. But I know that I personally came from a business background, and I personally don't like the idea of forcing someone to do something, because I think there's a fundamental right, and the way I've become so creative is by being able to do what I want. So I kind of really want to, I think, it's like, I think of like Killmonger at the end of like Black Panther, when he says it's like better to live, it's like live free or die, essentially the New Hampshire motto. And I really adhere to that. I think there's not worth living in a world where we all have like a carbon score, and if you go above a certain carbon score, you can't like go out to a bar, or you can't like socialize with people because you're a bad person. But at the same time, we need to live in a livable world. So I think the free market approach for me personally allows me to be very creative and not force people to do the work we need to get done, even though I say it needs to get done. But I can't take away people's freedom because it's taken centuries and centuries of humanity working to create this amazing America experiment. And it seems like we have such a blessing, and it could go fleeting away with one dictator, one Putin type character. So you have something to say. Yeah.
No, and I think, the business model that you have is actually a great example of what we talk about market-based solutions, because you're saying, we're going to make a profit, we're going to make money. That's what a business exists to do. But also, we're going to give back, and there is, we know that consumers, because they've been doing this over the past couple of decades since this has really become prevalent, consumers want to make decisions that they can feel good about, and they want to do business with businesses that are looking out for the world. And so I think that's exactly right.
I agree with you, but I don't think that businesses exist to make a profit. I think that businesses exist to propagate a mission, whether that's Apple trying to inspire or enable the individual to be as powerful, as creative as large corporations, or it's Amazon trying to develop the ultimate customer experience for purchasing things. I don't think that the companies are existing to make profit, but that seems to be the mechanism that most effectively creates the largest amount of impact, versus the only one that could pair is a government. And that there's really no freedom involved in a government. The government exists to create mandates. So it's like they're both all right. They're interesting forms of organizing things, but I tend to swing to the freedom side because I have a bias to continue to be free. So in your opinion, what role does the government have to play in the desire to decrease greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, I mean, look at some of the environmental regulations that we have in this country that got rid of acid rain and have cleaned up waterways and continue. There's a big initiative right now to get rid of lead pipes and replace those. I mean, that to me is a great place the government should be involved. When it comes to punishing businesses, over regulating to the point where they are strangled, and really, especially the small businesses, which is a background that I come from with my family. That is where I start to draw the line. And I think anytime that we talk about, I think we throw around government action way too loosely today. We see a problem. Let's get a piece of legislation to expand the size of government to deal with it. And I wish that we were able to take a step back and say, at the end of the day, government enforcement means someone gets fined, someone goes to jail. So like there are serious repercussions with that. And I wish we weren't so willing to throw that around and just think that government legislation should be the go-to solution there. And so the role that government plays is to keep us safe, and to keep us protected. And I, again, would go back to some of the environmental regulations and some of the legislation. I would also say that the government has passed to incentivize business. So it's more of a carrot versus the stick.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a great use, not only of taxpayer money, but also just a great use of governing force to say we're going to help things trend in the right direction. Now, you have to do that without picking winners and losers. That's an important distinction. But the government should certainly be involved in that way, because really there's you can't, for some of these things, you can't rely on necessarily private industry to do that.
Sure. It's a complex topic, but one of the most terrifying ways about this idea of legislating your way out of every single human issue that exists is that when you write the laws, they don't disappear. They just write more laws on top of them based
Yeah.
on the old ones. And there's this idea of precedent in the Supreme Court where everything is based off of the laws we write today is going to be screwing over people 100 years from now. Whereas, like, if you run a company, like I think off the top of my, what was it? Nikon was like the camera company. Like when when their products don't make sense anymore, they go out of business. Whereas like laws, they never disappear. One of the interesting things, I was just telling my friend about this the other day, is that I was listening to Elon Musk. Someone asked him how they should run like government on Mars, and I loved what he said. He said that like laws should have like an expiration date. Like after 90 years, the law should automatically dissolve unless people vote to like reinstate it. I would love to see that in America, because there's some laws that seem kind of crazy. So as far as actually effectively mitigating climate change without creating like legislation or mandates or restrictions on people, what are your thoughts on how to effectively actually get this done?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. I mean, the big campaign that our organization has been pushing recently, and it was an educational campaign, is about natural climate solutions. So think back to grade school science when you learned that trees capture carbon out of the air, and use that as sort of that's nature repairing the world. So natural climate solutions would be things like that. It would be like restoring our wetlands and forest lands and better forest management and regenerative agriculture, all of this stuff that contributes to allowing nature to essentially fight back against climate change. I think that's a really good thing. And the cool thing about it is that everyone agrees. 90% of people agree that planting trees as a way to reduce carbon emissions is a good thing. I'd love to meet the 10% that doesn't believe in that. We did some polling recently and found that specifically among young American voters, 18 to 30, 80% of them agree that we should be planting more trees. This is something that is extremely low cost because largely it's on landowners, forest owners, water landowners. And it's something that the government, again, can incentivize, but it's not a set of regulations. It's not a set of rules. And the other cool thing about natural climate solutions, which I think more people should be talking about, is studies are showing that if they were implemented correctly on a global scale, we could reach our 2030, we could get 37% of the way to our 2030 climate goals. Now, more than a third of the way to our carbon emission goals by just one kind of solution of like planting trees and making our soil healthier. I think that's a no-brainer. And it's something that gets drowned out for some of the more, for lack of a better term, some of the more sexy climate legislation out there, some of the stuff that gets more media play because planting trees is not as good of a cable news hit as other stuff. But if we're serious about fighting climate change, we've got to be serious about the solutions that have bipartisan support and that people can do today, not 10 years from now.
Have you put any thought into how to make these natural climate solutions economically viable, or to get industry to invest in these? Because I'm always trying to figure out a way to make that make a lot of sense. Whereas we talked about profit before, businesses might not exist for profit, in my opinion, but they definitely want some. So have you put any thought into how we can get industry to invest in natural climate solutions and actually get a return?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of ways. I mean, first of all, we're seeing that for corporations to have a sustainability department, that's a relatively new department that companies have. And these sustainability departments, I mean, some of it is PR. They want to look good and show their communities that they care about these issues. But also there is a consumers have put pressure on companies to be more uh, more focused on environmentally sound practices. And so you see companies all the time planting trees to offset their carbon emissions, or companies that have to cut down trees for products. They're replanting trees where that wasn't always the standard practice. And what they're finding is that it's actually not that big of a financial burden, if it's even one at all. Sometimes it's quite profitable for them to do these things because they're essentially rebuilding their supply of resources. But also the consumer demand, people are just buying more from these companies who have environmental plans, sustainability plans. And so I think that, this is sort of one of those things where we're still relatively new into this idea of corporations being stewards of the environment. And as we see with new things in a market, it takes some time to reach that profitability point, just like in a business in general. It could take you 5 to 10 more years to reach profitability. It's the same sort of thing. We're trending in the upwards direction. And so I think in many ways it's already getting there.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's in many ways it's on the consumer to make it profitable for the producer to create a more environmentally sound product. And
Yeah,
by demanding, yeah,
you vote with your dollars, right? And granted, for most of the things that people buy, we're not actively thinking about, is this product made in a sustainable way? Is the company that I'm supporting focus on sustainability? But I do think that people have become more aware about that, and they're becoming more aware about that, and it is something that people are worried about. I mean, I find myself now, like, I just got stuff for my garden on the patio, and I'm looking at organic soils versus regular soils because I've learned
mm,
more about chemicals and all. I mean, it's just about education of consumers, and we've seen that they will choose the better option, even if it costs them a little bit more. But over time, of course, those costs go down.
yeah, and that's ideal. Would you consider carbon pricing a limited government strategy for mitigating climate change?
Yeah, I'll caveat here and say that I'm speaking on behalf of my opinion rather than the opinion of my organization on carbon pricing. I am personally not a fan, and there's a couple of reasons. Number one, I don't think it is inherently a limited government solution. In my view, many iterations of it is a carbon tax. Um, I would much rather see, again, it is a stick, not the carrot. Um, my biggest concern with it is that whenever burdens are placed on business, we often see that they're not eating those costs. They are putting those costs down on consumers. And what I am very concerned about with carbon pricing or a carbon tax is primarily the communities that already are economically struggling, and especially right now where we have an energy crisis and economic stagflation, all this stuff. I'm worried about the effect of that on people who already can't afford where things are currently. So that's number one. Number two, I think it does grow the scope and size of government. And then number three, in my mind, it's a broken window fallacy, which is to say that it is a policy that we are trying to use to repair things that have already happened rather than focus on the future and try to find ways to reduce the effect of things that are going to happen, a year or a week, a month, a year, 10 years from now. And so for me, the carbon pricing model just isn't feasible from an economic standpoint. It's also not politically feasible. We've seen it brought up multiple times by members of Congress, and it just doesn't go anywhere. People aren't very fond of the idea.
So, in your point of view, so do you consider carbon CO2 waste going into the environment an externality that's untaxed, or is that just it's just not in your kind of ideal of the way the economic machine works?
In my view, the carrot that you put in place is to open up carbon markets and make it. I learned this just yesterday.
The voluntary market.
There are only 11 carbon capture facilities around the world. These are facilities that are literally sucking carbon out of the air and storing it or using it for another use. Only 11 of those. We should be building more of those. We should be opening carbon markets to where companies can pay to offset their emissions. Many of them already are doing that. If we're just speaking realistically here, that is the only way that we get to carbon to net zero is if we have carbon offsets to make that happen.
But why are they going to get involved in the voluntary carbon market? Are you going to say because the consumer is demanding that they become net zero?
Well, that's certainly one of the biggest drivers of them doing it voluntarily right now. We've seen an exponential increase in companies going into those carbon markets. And the other cool thing about carbon markets is it benefits forest landowners, ranch landowners, because they are the ones who are essentially, in the traditional model, planting the tree to offset carbon emissions. So they're getting income from that. And then companies are also paying into that, and scoring brownie points, if you will, with consumers and driving up their profits in the long run because of that.
Okay. But don't you think that there is a massive price to not reducing emissions? That if what if there was a mechanism that wasn't a government input? What if there was a way to price carbon that didn't come from the government? Would you be more likely to be in favor of that? Whether, I guess I'm trying to think of a self-imposed, I guess that's what net emission goals is for corporations. It's a
Yeah.
self-imposed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you have companies that are under no government pressure at the moment who are saying we are going to reach net zero by this year. You have industry associations who are saying part of membership is this commitment to being more economic or more environmentally sound and reaching net zero. And of course, major corporations, companies want to be a part of those trade associations. So yeah, I absolutely think there's a way to do that that isn't a government set carbon pricing.
Yeah. Okay. That's an interesting point. I'll have to think on that more. But I really appreciate you sharing that perspective because, as people know, I'm a huge advocate of carbon pricing. But I'm always looking for simple solutions, and it's never really simple with this kind of stuff. So, as far as like general views of conservative politicians who as we know in this country, have been really lacking on environmental stewardship, whether it be supporting legislation or speaking publicly about this stuff or denying climate change, what I find so strange about this is that, like, I brought this up several times, like Teddy Roosevelt started the national park system. Like, conservatives and Republicans are known for their environmental conservation support. What's going on, man, these days?
That's what we're trying to fix. Yeah, you're right. I mean, conservatives and Republicans have a strong conservation record. It's not just, Teddy Roosevelt kind of kicked off American conservation environmentalism, which is really great. It's national parks, national forests, public lands. He did all of that,
Mm-hmm.
which is great. Richard Nixon, who, despite his flaws,
Yeah.
oversaw what many consider the peak of American environmentalism in the 70s. He created the EPA, had the Endangered Wildlife Act or Species Act, and there were clean air and water standards established under that. Even H.W. Bush, Reagan, up until George Bush, and then the 21st century broke, and we had. I mean, I don't put the blame on Al Gore, but I use that as an example. Al Gore came out and talked about global warming. It became a political issue. And in my view, what happened, and this is not an excuse, it's more of an explanation. In my view, what happened is Republicans saw Democrats start to lead on this issue and specifically talk about this idea of climate change, or as it was mostly referred to back then, global warming. And Republicans thought, we don't have an answer to this right now. And so we're a little scared. We're gonna turn this into a political issue. Call them crazy, but we're not going to sit at the table. Whereas they were like chairing the meetings before, and now they're leaving the table.
Wow.
The good news in my mind, that really sort of denialism peaked around the Tea Party '08 era, when Obama released his climate plan in '09. That was a big area of contention for Republicans, despite the fact that, by the way, Obama and McCain's climate policy during that election were very similar. They weren't really debating over much there, which is pretty cool to note. But I do think, thankfully, we're now on the decline of that. Something I always like to point out, right now in the U.S. House of Representatives, the third largest caucus, not of just Republicans, but the third largest caucus of the U.S. House at large, is the Conservative Climate Caucus, which is great because it's conservatives and it has the word climate in it. And so they're already gathering and talking about essentially reclaiming this issue. How do we get our seat back at the table? In the 5 years that ACC has been around, when we first started, you could not get a Republican politician to say the word climate change. Today, they are very open to it. There's still people on the outside who are hesitant or will say it in their own way, but we've made considerable progress just in the past 5 years. And I think you're gonna, as this issue becomes more and more important, especially young people, you're gonna see Republicans lead on this a lot more.
I sure hope so. And let's be real, there's people on the inside who aren't super favorable about it as well, whether it be the big T or anyone else. And then once you see a lot, this is really becoming an industry from my perspective with the people I talk to. There's a environmental stewardship and climate industry. There's big business, there's big money. And once these renewable energy companies outpace fossil fuel companies, it's going to be, I think, a lot of renewed interest. There's a lot of forces behind it that are pushing it. So I appreciate what y'all are doing to keep that movement going.
Something
Um,
that's cool to, if you don't mind me,
I
something
don't.
that's cool to point out. There's an article, I think it was in the Atlantic, called the Korean Vortex. Um, we talk about there hasn't been a major piece of environmental legislation from the Congress. When President Obama came into office, he laid out that 2009 climate plan. And what it said in part is, number one, we want to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 17% by 2020. That bill never passed. Congress never acted on that. By 2020, we actually decreased it by 21%.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Yeah, and also it said that the U.S. needed to generate 20% of its electricity from renewables. In 2021, we surpassed that. And so it became described as this perfect storm of business and technology and policy and private individuals and NGOs coming together, acting on this issue without a single piece of major climate legislation from the federal government. We were able to accomplish all these things. So I think it shows that there's room there's room for progress, even if a climate bill doesn't get passed.
Well, you make a good case, man. I will say thank you for adding that in. I
Well,
suppose I think
of all places, it's like, it's good.
Yeah, I think a lot of what my listeners would be concerned about is if the time frame is going to make sense on that. A lot of people are really concerned about the IPCC report and the time frame on it. I don't really believe in the countdown clocks and that if we don't act within the next 10 years, we're all doomed. But I do believe that the longer we are not having an economy that's as efficient as it could be, not only are we decreasing life on Earth, but we're not living up to our full potential to be the amazing America that we truly can be. So that's my perspective. What are your like thoughts? So we talked a lot about like not having mandates or not imposing laws on people. What are some of the other issues you have with the left's like methodology for achieving climate action or environmental stewardship?
Yeah, one of the things that we say with our organization is action over activism. And what that means in my mind is there is absolutely a place for being an activist and going out and protesting and raising awareness for the issues that are destroying our planet. But at the end of the day, if you aren't working in your local community to do something about it and you're only standing outside with a megaphone yelling about it, I don't see the point. And I don't see those individuals as particularly useful in the movement. And so, what we try to do through things like cleanups and tree plantings, the argument against it is, the impact that y'all are having is very minimal compared to what needs to be done. And I fully give people that. By us cleaning up a park, we're not solving climate change, but we're doing something about it, and we're starting locally, and we're sort of putting our actions where our words are. And so that's what I think is important. And oftentimes on the left side of environmental advocacy, and I recognize they come from the same place that I do. We all want to make the earth a cleaner, greener place. But I think oftentimes um, it's one thing about not taking matters into your own hands and not doing something. It's another thing to say, the Build Back Better bill didn't get passed, and so all hope is lost. It's another thing to say if this piece of legislation doesn't get passed, if the Green New Deal doesn't get passed, we are doomed. Um, I'm personally, I'm not interested in having a discussion about doomsday scenarios if the government doesn't act. I'm more interested in about what can we do as individuals to push this forward. And so the cool thing is, although our organization is center right, what I mentioned is that we have a lot of people who self-identify as liberals or Democrats who join us, and they like it because we're on the ground doing the action. We're putting, like I said, action over activism.
Well, what really is the government at the end of the day but a group of people getting together and doing things? I mean, we are the government. Now you can look at it as the sense that you want to go all the way up to the top and create the rules that are going to facilitate the way everyone acts. Or you can look at the rules, which, by the way, in this country are kind of guidelines in many ways. I mean, there are certain rules like not murdering people that are very strict, but I mean, other things you can kind of ski by. You don't have to comment on that. That's just my perspective. But
You don't have to stop at the stop sign if it doesn't have what is a white outline or something like that.
I'm just saying, like, you can shift the society by leading by example, and it's not even about shifting the whole society. It's about making the area around you better by being a better version of yourself. I mean, you can take it down to the individual level, you can take it up to the whole society needing to be better, but the only thing you have control over is what you do, is what you wake up in the morning and what you want to do. If you're a person who wants to advocate for policy, might not be your forte, but maybe it's someone else's. But if you're really passionate about this issue, you can find a way it meshes with your personality and go out and do something. So I like how you mentioned that there are people who identify as liberals and Democrats that join your organization. Do you think this issue is a place where we can kind of mend the divide and kind of unite? And I'm specifically talking about us, our generation, our young folks. Is this somewhere where we can kind of get rid of this? I don't even know what to call it anymore. This clown show that's going on, where like if one, like you said, oh, like the Republicans saw that the Democrats were for this, so they decided like, hold on, that can't be good. Is this something where we can kind of like unite and mend this divide over the time?
Yeah, I think our tolerance as a younger generation for some of this BS is much lower, because, like you mentioned, with some of the countdown clocks, right, that people subscribe to. Um, I don't necessarily believe in those either, but I do know that we need to act soon. We need to do something soon. There is an urgency to it, and I think young people see that there is an urgency, and our politicians are not always thinking too long term because, to be a little on the nose, they're not here for long term, given the average age of Congress. But what I will say is that young people are very interested in um, being a much better version of a generation than the ones that have come before us in terms of actually creating progress on this issue. And again, when I have conversations with people, oftentimes politics doesn't even come up in it. I tell them about the climate solutions that I believe in, like planting trees or making our soil healthier, and these are things that conservatives believe in, liberals believe in, people who are apolitical believe in. Um, I really think the bulk of our solutions are apolitical. We get hung up on the political stuff if you are a political person, because I guess in some way it's fun to have something to go up against. It's fun to have something to debate, but that gets in the way of us doing things that matter, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we get caught up in these political debates, we're spending our time focusing on that when we could be spending our time focusing on the 90% of things that we do agree on. And so I think a challenge for our generation is going to be to focus more on that 90%.
Sure. Well, I'm thinking of, for example, let's say that you were going to do a local tree planting event, and let's say, for example, that I'm a big government guy, and I want mandates galore. I want the government to tell us what to do for everything, and I show up to this event, and then I meet you, and we're talking about environmental stewardship, and oh my God, if you plant this tree, it can draw down all this carbon, it'll release all these nutrients into the soil, and this is going to be awesome. And me and you get to talking, and maybe we go an hour talking about climate change, and then all of a sudden we come to this topic of how to go about doing it. The government is, I feel like it's one thing to like read your bio and be like, I'm a conservative, I believe in this, and then be like, oh, I wouldn't want to work with that guy. And then another thing to go and meet you and see that you're a human and that we all just want to live in a beautiful, prosperous world. And then you come to a point where you disagree. It's almost, I mean, I'm kind of crazy, but I think that's almost like fun. Like it's great. Like if we both had the same beliefs, I feel like that's kind of boring. Like it's, if you're united on values and you can see most people's values, it's like have a happy family, live a happy life, make money, go out and be creative or whatever. It just seems like Yeah, it's like, the age old way of bringing people together. I'm just not sure how it is. I don't know. Those are my thoughts on like uniting people.
It should be fun to interact with people who don't believe what you believe. And I think that the biggest tool that people don't use enough is we can agree to disagree, and then we can work very hard on the things we do agree on. It seems like sometimes today you reach a disagreement, and that's sort of the end of a relationship with somebody, and that's not how we're meant to be as people. And that's certainly not us being like nice to each other. Um, yeah, there are people who I talk to all the time where they have a totally different worldview than I do. I usually learn something from them. I've had my mind changed a couple of times, or at least my perspective change, or better context because of those conversations. So I love having those conversations because it either will change my mind and open my mind up to a better way to do something, or it'll make me understand better where people are coming from. And so when I'm advocating for something in the future, I can keep that in mind and think about how to speak to that.
One of the things I think I might be wrong, but I've found is like if you're very like far left, they almost have more contempt for people. I'll speak from like personal example. Like I really didn't I was like I voted for Joe, but like during the primary, I was like, okay, anyone but Joe. Like as long as it's not Joe, like I'm good. And it's I feel like there is this tendency to like if you're further down the spectrum to have more contempt for people who are trying to achieve the same things as you in a different way than you have for the person who is trying to do it like who is trying to go for something different because at least they're not like getting in your way. I don't know if that like made sense, but it's just yeah, it's just a strange phenomenon that if you're going after the same thing, but you're going about it a different way, you almost get more angry at that person because you're like, why are you doing it that way? You should be doing it my way. I've got to figure it out. You know what I mean?
Everyone has a way. I think that's what I've learned is that everyone has a preference and a way to do something, and finding the middle ground is really tough. We often speak about it like it's like this pie in the sky idea, but we often just speak about like it's easy, just come together and find a middle ground. It's actually really tough to do that because people, like you said, are really dead set oftentimes on their ways of doing something. Um, I would contend that even people on the far right kind of have that view toward, like in an election system, have that view toward the more moderate
Of
candidate.
course.
So yeah, I think that's completely normal.
Yeah, but it shouldn't be. If
It
you if
should.
we
I
if we
agree.
want the same stuff, it's like how you go about doing it. I guess it's one thing if you're going to destroy the world to reach your goal versus save it or fix it, but
I think it becomes a difference between incrementalist and I would kind of call them not at all with a negative connotation, but revolutionary, right?
mhm.
On our organization and me personally, I believe that we should make steady progress toward what we want, whereas some people want to get in there, shake everything up, and either blow it all over, start from scratch, or tear down a lot of, move fast and break things, as the old Apple um, motto used to go. Um, that's maybe an interesting debate to have of which is best. Many people think that incrementalism in the climate conversation that we don't have time to do that,
Mhm.
but I would argue that the time that we spend arguing over those revolutionary ideas is time that we can spend implementing the more incremental ideas, and we'd actually get a lot further quicker than going the other route.
Very, very eloquently put. And I think what a lot of people don't appreciate, and speaking from experience, I don't really. This is probably the most politics I've talked in months. I don't spend too much time in this sphere. But as a young man, a young arrogant man, in 18, I was watching secular talk and all like Bernie rallies and getting really into like this idea of revolutionary, and I wanted to take over the world and change everything. But if you have a kind of thorough understanding of history, you really need to appreciate how significant the moment in history we live in now. The US is only 200 and something years old. This experiment that we've conducted has like created more prosperity. It's destroyed lots of nature. I'm not going to deny that at all. And not everyone's equal, but it's created this amazing amount of prosperity. And the history of humanity has been domination by kings. There's always been a monarch who's been leading the society, and this is this one experiment that we had where we actually allowed people, besides maybe like Greece, like allowed people to actually have a say in what we do. And then of course it's just a very like it gets really deep, the necessity of human greed and the fact that there's a 1% that has more wealth and control than anyone else, but it's more even than it's ever been. And this idea that you want to be revolutionary and like tear everything down, it's just, at least I would recommend that people look into like the history of communism and the history of monarchical systems and lords and turfs and whatever it was. Like it's not as bad as it could be now. In fact, it's actually kind of good. But people will tell me that's my white privilege talking, but it is what it is. All right, man. Enough of my thoughts. Do you we're kind of getting to the end here. Do you kind of see this climate change issue as more like intersectional, or is it more like a logistical, scientific, we just need to draw down CO2, or is this more at like the root of the issue of society?
I mean, at the core, it's about cutting emissions, right? That's climate change, and that's what we talk about. But to get there, and the effects of it are certainly intersectional. I mean, we're talking about. I've had some really interesting conversations over the past year about how climate affects people of color differently, communities that are disadvantaged, and I think that's really important for us to talk about. And that's one of the, going back to the pricing, the price on carbon thing. I mean, that's like where one of my concerns comes from. And so, yeah, this is something that is it touches on every part of our society, and anything that is economic is inherently touches everything in a society. And so I would definitely say it's more intersectional, and the conversations that are being hosted between communities, I think, are important to have. And for example, I was raised in Houston. It's a big energy production. I mean, Texas in general is a big energy production state, but Houston is, you're either employed in the energy industry or you know someone who is, someone in your family is. When we have a discussion about a transition to clean energy, the way that translates to people in people's minds in Houston is, my livelihood's about to get cut off. And there are some that would say, well, you make money through a dirty practice like tough. But I would say people don't do that because they're bad people. People do that because they want to feed a family, they want to support a family. And we should be able to approach these conversations and say, how do we do this in a fair way? How do we do this in a just way, to where people can keep their livelihoods, where we can actually increase the quality of life, and keep that trend going? And how can we do it in a way that's going to be fair to all the communities that don't typically have the advantages that the majority communities, if you will, have? So it's not a discussion that I'm an expert on, but I think it's a really interesting one, and it's something we have to keep in mind.
I don't consider myself an expert on anything, and I hope to never
That's
do.
good.
Yeah, it is good, man. It's nice to be a generalist and just kind of try and make sure everyone can understand what really smart people are saying. That's kind of the idea with this podcast. I do want to squeeze in one more question for you, which is kind of unrelated to climate change. I just would love to hear your perspective on it. I personally, I understand why politicians really harp when they're making a policy proposal. They're saying, if we do this, it's going to create lots of jobs, so you should do this. But I'm of the opinion that we shouldn't be proposing changes in order to create jobs, but rather improve the economy. So just because someone's working doesn't mean they're being efficient. I just wanted to gauge your perspective on that right before we signed off here.
That's a really interesting. I've never heard someone put it that way, but
They
that's
can't
actually,
say it. They can't say it publicly, because if you talk about
yeah.
not caring about jobs, you're not going to get votes. It's not going to happen.
Well, and I don't even think that's saying that you don't care about jobs. I think it's saying, I actually think that that's you saying you care more about like human dignity and just a better society. And I would argue that when you do that, you're going to create jobs as a side effect. Creating jobs is sort of one of those really popular low hanging fruit things. And I guess that's my problem with political topics in general, whether it's climate change or whether it's anything. We are so comfortable because we've been dumbed down by media, by politicians. We're so comfortable having these surface level conversations that I describe it as like we're not having sober conversations because we're either really angry about something or we don't actually know what we're talking about. And so we just say what feels good and what sounds good. I love when people say it's time for a national discussion about X issue because it's never a national discussion, right? Like a presidential debate is never an intellectual exercise in how we should solve issues.
It's basically TikTok now.
Basically, I would not be surprised if the next election has a TikTok debate. I'm cringing at that. But I mean, one of the reasons why we focus so much on local communities is I think if you're going to have intelligent discussions with people who know what they're talking about, you got to be doing it at the local level. You have to be talking about, your neighbor Jim down the street and the mayor and Susan and all, all these, like, you need to be talking with people who are going to affect it. Sorry, that's kind of a rant based on what you said, but I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. We should be improving society as a whole rather than just talking about creating jobs.
That's exactly right. Yeah. I just wanted to throw that in the end, man. Stephen, I appreciate it. It's been great having you on the podcast, man. Really, really great to get your perspective. I appreciate what your organization is doing. And I'm excited. I'm happy that it's started by young people. I'm happy that you're engaging conservatives. Keep up the great work. Any final pieces of advice for young folks who are just passionate about making this world a better place?
Yeah, I would say don't assume that you have to be an expert or well trained to get out and try stuff. There are people all the time who decide they're just tired of the status quo. They're tired of feeling frustrated, and they're just going to get out and figure this stuff out. My advice is that you're not going to be perfect when you start. You're not going to be perfect 10, 15, 20 years after you start. It is a lifelong process, but the mentality of it's better to start today than to never start. I would beg people do something and be a part of the positive impact that you want to see in the world.
And it will positively impact your life every day by taking a step. You just got to get that momentum going. Stephen, I appreciate the time, man. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Stephen. Appreciate it.
You got it. All right, everybody. See you on the next one. So if you or anyone else you know is looking to buy or sell a home anywhere in the USA and would like to create thousands of dollars in donations without any cost out of pocket, please visit ccrealty.org today.